Hi everyone, this is Pastor Jason Abbott with Glade Baptist Church, and we're doing our next series in our Bible study. If you're a member of Glade Baptist Church or a visitor, then we're glad you're connecting with us through these videos and staying up to date with our Bible study. And if maybe you're somebody who just connected with us through Facebook and YouTube, and that's how you know us, then welcome. We're glad you're doing that. And all of y'all that sent comments and messages and those things, keep them coming. We like to respond to those and interact with you guys in that way. And so we're appreciative of that. We're on our next week after Easter, and so we're still talking about the resurrection in our Bible study, and so that's kind of where we're going to be going. I just want to give you a heads up. When I was thinking about this sermon today and this message, I thought about a story. It's these two guys are driving along in the car and come up to a red light, and he just goes right through it. He just speeds up and goes right through it. And his buddy sitting next to him says, "Man, what are you doing? You're going to get us killed." He says, "That's crazy." He says, "Don't worry, my brother drives this way." And so they go around a little bit further, come up to another red light. He hits the gas, goes right through it. And his friend's freaking out. He says, "Man, you are dangerous." He says, "That is going to get us killed." He says, "Don't worry, my brother drives this way." And well, a little bit later on, they finally go on and they come up to a green light. And he hits the brake. It stops right there. And his friend says, "Man, that's crazy." He says, "What is this about?" He says, "My brother might be coming the other way." Now, I like that story, and I tell it a lot because it kind of reminds me of an incident that happened with me when I was a student at UGA years ago. But I also like it because it kind of makes a point that you have to be on the same page with other people. It's important that you're on the same page with other people. And if there are important people in your life, people you value, the relationship, in different areas of life, they can be even more important that you be on the same page with them. Think about like a husband and wife, a marriage. It's important to be on the same page with your spouse. A wife might say something like,
"We need to work on paying off all our debts."
But a husband might say, "Honey, but I need a new truck. I mean, it's going to be something for both of us. We need to have a new truck." So a wife might say something like,
"We really need to be watching what we eat and eating healthier."
And a husband might say, "Honey, I eat healthy enough. It was just last week I had a carrot." You see? And a wife might then say,
"I think you spend too much time hunting."
But a husband might say, "Well, that's just not true. And you can't count the first 4 weeks before I shot anything." You see, a husband and wife have to be on the same page. It's crucial. They have to be seeing things the same way, have the same perspective on important things, the goals, the priorities. That's how it has to be because it's a very important relationship. Well, it's that way with other things. I mean, if you think about employers and, your boss and that kind of thing, well, it's pretty important that you be on the same page with them. That way the company, your department within the company and all that runs smoothly. Right? That's crucial. You can think about a student. It's important that they're on the same page as their teacher, or in college as their professor. And so there's other areas that's pretty important as well. You think about parents and children. It's pretty important that they're on the same page because they need to have the same priorities, same goals, same perspective on things. Now, when they don't, obviously, the consequences are pretty disastrous. Obviously, the consequences, the marriage can end up in divorce. There can be a serious problem at school for the student. The parent-child relationship may have a huge rift. There might be job consequences with, the employer. And so there's pretty big consequences when you are not on the same page with somebody. Now, I say all that because it's pretty important above all, that you are on the same page with God. When God's will and His priorities and His perspective is there, we have to then adjust so that we can be on the same page with God. Okay? And so that's what our purpose of today's message is about, being on the same page with God. We want to be on the same page with God. That way we're in His will, following His priorities, His plans, with His perspective. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. on the same page with God. Are you on the same page with God? Well, let's look at that. If you have a Bible or want to look at something online or a device, we'll be going to the New Testament. And once you get to the New Testament, flip on over till you get to the book of Acts. And that's ACTS. For some of y'all that may not be familiar, it's Acts as in actions. And it's short for the Acts of the Apostles. And so it picks up right at the beginning in Acts chapter 1 with the events that are still within the time frame of the resurrection before Jesus ascends. And so we're still in that resurrection time period, those weeks that he was working and with his apostles. And so Acts chapter 1 is where you want to be. So I'll give you a second to get there. Acts chapter 1. Now, a few things about the book of Acts in the Bible, New Testament. Well, it's written by Dr. Luke. He is a physician. He's a good friend of the missionary and the Apostle Paul. So you might know him that way. He's been with him on a lot of journeys. He chronicles a lot of things that he has seen firsthand, not just things he's heard from others. And this book of Acts is really interesting. It's almost like a research paper because he's doing it for somebody else, and it's kind of a follow-up as well to the Gospel of Luke. And so if you've read that and are familiar with that, you know, this is like part 2. This is like an extension of that. And so even though it's separate, it follows a timeline that began in Luke and then it continues forward. You can see it almost seamlessly right from the end of Luke into the book of Acts. And so that's what we're looking at today. So if you have that, when you get to the book of Acts, chapter 1, we're going to be picking up in verse 6. And so this is a piece of the story where Jesus, in his resurrected body, is having a conversation with his friends, those who follow him. And so he's having this conversation, and so that's what is going on right in the middle of the narrative. Acts chapter 1, verse 6 is where we'll start. And it says, "So when they had come together, they asked him, 'Lord, at this time are you restoring the kingdom of Israel?'" And so let's break that down. It says, so when they had come together, and so they were apart, but now the context is a group setting. They had come together, and they asked him, okay, this is not one lone guy with his hand up at the back, you know, or something like that, or Peter just kind of speaking out like sometimes you see him doing. No, this is they. This is a question. This is something, you know, more than one person. It's a group of them. You know, this is what they're bringing to Jesus. This is their question. Now, you might think, if you're talking to somebody that was just in a grave and they walked out of it after everybody, and probably you too, seen them brutally killed, you know, what would you ask them? What would you say to them? What kind of questions would come up? Well, they've got all the seem to have all the same thing in mind. And this is how it goes. They asked him, "Lord, at this time, are you restoring the kingdom of Israel?" That's what's on everybody's mind. That's what's front and center. The Romans tried to kill you. You died on a cross. You came back. Now you are here among us. Now is the time. Are you restoring the kingdom of Israel? Is it now? Because we're ready. So this is the question. Verse 7. "And Jesus said to them, 'It is not for you to know times or periods that the Father has set by his own authority.'" Verse 8. "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, all of Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And so first off, Jesus responds, and he says, It is not for you to know the times. And so that whole thing about when, that, you've got this big question mark about, that you want to know about, that you're anxious about, is it a waiting time? Is it soon? That kind of thing. He says, it's not for you to know. I'm not going to give you a timetable. And then he says, but you will receive power. See, their question was about power. They wanted power to overthrow, to push out the Romans, because they were the occupiers, they were the controllers of their nation. They were the invaders. They were the foreigners who were exerting control over their land. And the Romans were there, and so they want to know, when are we going to have the power? When is Israel going to be restored? See, Jesus recognizes that their question is about power. And then we find out real quickly that they're not on the same page with God. They're not on the same page. And so he understands that their question is about power, and he says, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth. He says, you're going to receive power to be my witnesses. Now, they wanted to receive power so that they could march into Jerusalem as winners. And he says, I want you to receive power so you can be a witness. Now, this all stems from the idea that they had, that their biggest problem was the Romans. The Roman occupation. That was their biggest problem. They wanted Jesus to give them a timetable about when that problem was going to be solved. And so they asked that. Jesus, when is this going to be taking place? We think Israel needs to be restored. They wanted the Romans kicked out. And so their idea of their biggest problem was a physical one, their circumstances. That's what page they're on. But what does Jesus say? He says, you will receive power to be my witnesses from God's Spirit. See, Jesus was wanting to make them into witnesses. They wanted to be, victors. They wanted to be winners marching through the streets of Jerusalem. And Jesus says, no, what you need, what's your biggest problem is actually a spiritual one. Because you're going to need God's Spirit, the Holy Spirit, to be my witnesses. You think your biggest problem is the physical one. You think it's the circumstances. But your biggest problem is a sin problem. It's a spiritual problem. And you're going to need to rely on God's Spirit going forward. You're going to need that. Now, if you were thinking like them, it's understandable. Because if you were asked, what is your biggest problem? You might think of a physical one, just like they did. One that is kind of created by circumstances. You might think, okay, my biggest problem is this. And more than likely, you would come up with something that was physical, that was dependent on circumstances. That's understandable. In fact, for a lot of us right now, if you asked us what the biggest problem is that we have, we'd probably say, well, it starts with a V and rhymes with iris. That's what we'd probably come up with. That's our biggest problem. Those circumstances that it creates are our biggest problem. And that would be understandable. But let's listen to what Jesus is telling us. Our biggest problem is that we need to rely on God's Spirit. Because we have a sin problem. And our sin problem keeps us from doing that. Our sin problem pulls us away into destructive patterns. Our sin problem turns us away from God. And so we have to solve that problem by continually relying on God's Spirit. Now, the physical circumstances that we see around us, and we might say, okay, this is my biggest problem. Okay, just if whatever you would come up with, if you came up with an idea and said, okay, this is my biggest problem, and you can even back it up before COVID-19 and say 6 months ago, whatever it would be. Okay, this is my biggest problem. You'd probably come up with one that was built around certain circumstances and was a physical one. But play that out. Let's say God removed that problem from your life. Whatever it was, whatever you came up with, He removed it. It's gone. It's not an issue anymore. It's behind you. Okay? Let's say He did that. Well, what is staring at you right now then? Well, probably, like I said, if you decided what's your biggest problem, what's staring at you now is whatever your second biggest problem was. That's what you're dealing with now. That's what you've got to contend with. Whatever was number 2 just moves up to number 1. Now you've got those circumstances to deal with. Now you have to deal with that. And the thing is that if you're not relying on God's Spirit, then whatever those circumstances, whatever those hardships, whatever those problems, those physical ones that you think are your biggest ones, they're still going to be the determining factor in your character if you're not relying on God's Spirit. You're still going to be a victim to them. You're still going to be subject to them. If you're not relying on God's Spirit, those problems will still make you anxious and fearful and steal your peace because you're dealing with not what is not really your biggest problem. Your biggest problem is your sin nature, because that leads you to turn away from God and puts you into destructive patterns. That's your biggest problem. Now, that's understandable that a lot of people would think that way. But look at the other side of the coin too. Let's say God, and you might have experienced this time in your life, you might have experienced something like this, where it seems like all those problems have somehow just gone away. Maybe you're like, well, I can't imagine that. But a lot of people have those seasons of life where all of those hardships just kind of have just drifted away. That all those challenges, those physical ones, those ones that are, built around so many circumstances, that they're just gone. And maybe they have a season of success, maybe affluence. Life is easy. And God has removed all those things. But if you're not dealing with your biggest problem, if you're not relying on God's Spirit, even in those good seasons, what's likely to happen? You're likely to be prideful. You're likely to be self-centered. You're likely to be feeling independent and arrogant. You're likely to be turning away just as much from God in the bad circumstances are in the good circumstances. There's no protection just because of those circumstances. We don't need our character to be dependent on circumstances. We don't let circumstances dictate it. We have to depend and rely on God's Spirit to deal with the sin problem that we have to deal with, whether in good times or bad times. We have to deal with it that way. We have to deal with the sin problem, because there will be good times and there will be bad times. And if you remember from the Old Testament, one of the warnings that God gave Israel when He was about to bless them with the land and all the abundance and the resources that it would have, and He was just basically going to hand it to them as such a great blessing. And He warns them about the tendency to become prideful and turn away and to forget Him in the midst of all that abundance and then to think that they created that abundance. Our biggest problem, if you want to be on the same page with God, is to recognize that our biggest problem is sin, and we need to be relying on God's Spirit. Our biggest problem is sin. It's a spiritual problem, and we need to be relying on God's Spirit. So, let me give you a suggestion. If you find yourself in the midst of circumstances, whether right now or next week or next month, whatever, if you find yourself just so overwhelmed by circumstances, these physical things, you find yourself just so stressed out and so anxious and sleepless, if you find yourself in that pattern, think of that as the check engine light in your car. The check engine light comes on and you're like, whoop, something's going on I don't know about, something's under that hood, or wherever, and I need to address it, I need to get it taken to the mechanic in the shop, and I got to make an appointment and whatever else, because something's going on serious that I need to pay attention to that I don't really know what the root cause of it is right now, but there's something going wrong. Think of it like that check engine light. If you are starting to feel that way, just overwhelmed, just consumed by those negative circumstances, stressed out, sleepless, worrisome, if you just find yourself in that way, think of that as the check engine light. You're not relying on God, and you're not dealing with the biggest problem. You're letting your circumstances dictate you. You're not rising above them. So think of it that way. And remember that even in the good times, positive things happening, a season of blessing, remember that because of our sin nature, we are still prone to turn away from God and go down a destructive path, even in the best of times. We're prone to do it even in the best of times. So that's what I want to encourage you to do. Check up on yourself. Is the check engine light on? Do you need to address something? Is something going on that you need to pay attention to and realize and be on the same page with God about, that this is a spiritual issue? You need to be relying on God, not so caught up in everything going around you that you need to deal with a sin nature that's destructive. Check up on yourself. When things are going grand and life is easy and it's success, remember, you're still very, very prone in those good seasons to turn away from God. You still have to deal with your biggest problem, sin nature. You still have to be relying on God. Don't let your circumstances dictate your character. Don't let your circumstances dictate your character. That's my prayer for you today.